Hey, this is Pete Dominic, and this is another episode of Stand Up Presents Ana Marie Cox, Getting Better. This show is fully funded by listeners like you. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic right now. Very excited that Ana Marie Cox is back with episode 2 of Getting Better. Last week's episode was a huge hit. Thank you so much for all of your amazing feedback. So excited to get Ana Marie Cox back and hosting a podcast, if even just a few episodes. Today's is so good. I produced and edited it, and I'm really excited to share it with you today. Two extremely smart, thoughtful people having a wide-ranging discussion touching on so many important and personal issues, as well as impactful political and economic issues. Today, Ana welcomes a great guest, Oliver Broudy, who she will tell you more about in a moment. But just in case you don't know, Ana Marie Cox is one of the most established and respected journalists of our generation. She's now a political columnist for the New Republic and a culture critic whose writing has appeared just about everywhere. She hosted With Friends Like These, a podcast from Crooked Media from 2017 to 2022. She conducted the Talk interviews feature in the New York Times Magazine. Remember that at the end of the magazine? She did that for 2 years. 15 to 17, she was the senior political correspondent for MTV News, which certainly put her on the map. And of course, she started the snarky political blog Wonk Hat back in 2004. Go follow her on Blue Sky, and she's just barely back on Twitter, where she's promoting this podcast and her other work, including her great writing workshop, virtual workshop that starts again in April, which is designed to help people reclaim the narrative of their lives in an essay that they can share with others. I hope you'll sign up for that. AnaMarieCox.com/third story. So happy to have her back for episode 2. I think you're really going to love it. So here now, Ana Marie Cox and Getting Better.
Thanks again, Pete. This is Ana Marie Cox. This is the second episode of Getting Better, and we are turning from recovery having to do with chemicals to, it's recovery having to do with chemicals. I'm going to be talking to Oliver Broudy. He is a freelance journalist who wrote a book called The Sensitives, The Rise of Environmental Illness and the Search for America's Last Pure Place. It is about people with environmental illness or chemical sensitivities, a category of illness that's existed for 40 or 50 years now, but is still somehow contested. Let's say people who have their illness ridiculed, mocked, not taken seriously by doctors. Oliver spent a lot of time in that community and wrote a book about traveling to the outskirts of society to try and find safety. And our conversation is fairly wide-ranging. We talk about his subject, of course, those with environmental illness, but pretty soon start talking about recovery having to do with mental health, recovery having to do with societal injustice. And towards the end, we talk about the importance of stories in recovery, the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell other people, which is a really good segue to remind you that I have a recovery writing workshop happening in April if you're interested. I'll mention it again at the end of the program. But without further ado, let's get to Oliver Broudy talking about his book, The Sensitives. Oliver, thank you for agreeing to talk to me.
It's a pleasure.
So I wanted to talk to you about your book because the name of this podcast is Getting Better, and it's about recovery in all its forms. And your book is a lot about the length people will go to get better, the extreme lengths people will go to get better, I think. What are the people in your book? Oh, go ahead and respond to that.
Well, I was anticipating some of these questions and I was expecting why write about this? And part of it was a fascination with that question. But I don't think that the subjects of this book would quite agree with that frame, because I think that it's not that they chose to go to this length. They were compelled to. These are people who are fleeing a world that they feel like they don't really belong in. It might as well be Mars to them. There was one guy who told me that he only felt at home halfway up Mount McKinley. It's an entirely different question as to what's going on with these people. But in terms of their experience of it, they are in flight. I think when it comes to recovery, there's a couple different, very broadly speaking, approaches, certainly in this community. And one is to engage and retrain your brain, exposure therapy, this kind of thing. and the other is to withdraw. So they're two different paradigms. So the second paradigm is more of like a medical paradigm, which is based on the idea that the body, if you leave it alone, will take care of itself. It reaches for homeostasis, and then you just need to let it do its work. That's medical. The former is more psychological, like you actually need to engage somehow and push it along. So that's the split on which this whole phenomenon of chemical and environmental sensitivity straddles. To what degree is it mental, psychological? To what degree is it medical? How do these two things come together? How are you supposed to interpret it? And however you come down on that kind of determines how you respond. That speaks to how people approach recovery. I think it's a question of how they address that decision.
Well, that's interesting because I actually really respond to this idea that maybe the people who you're writing about don't think of what they're doing in terms of getting better or the links to go to which they'll get better. Because there's a saying in recovery community or rooms of AA that a normal person drinks or uses drugs to feel good, and a addict or alcoholic drinks or uses drugs to feel normal. So that the recovery process isn't about getting better; it's just about living. Recovery can cover a lot of things, and also sometimes I've found like people are like, "Oh, you've done so much," or trying to give me a compliment, like the things that I've done to like better myself or better my recovery. And for me, some of those things have not felt like choices.
Yeah.
I'll die if I don't do those things. Is that the kind of framework you're talking about for the people that you've written about?
I think that when you were at your lowest, I'm sure there weren't a lot of choices for you. And everyone reaches that point. I think that even people who are extremely sensitive, and I want to be clear that we're talking about a disease that a quote unquote disease that everyone has to some extent. Like to some extent, everyone is sensitive to chemicals. We all know someone who's like, that woman's perfume is going to drive me bonkers. But there's a very small subset of people who are super, super sensitive. There are anecdotes of people who like pass out at an airport when a woman with a strong perfume, or man for that matter, is going by them. There's a sense of urgency, I think, for these people. And also, I think there is not quite the same path. It's an interesting comparison to compare this to alcoholism, because with alcoholism, it's always quite clear what needs to happen. And in fact, the monolithicness of what needs to happen is part of, I would wager, what makes it so difficult. It's one massive thing. It really is no clear path for people who are chemically or environmentally sensitive. There's no clear understanding in the medical world for what's going on. Medicine is very good at isolating phenomenon and figuring out single cause issues. But once it starts getting more complicated, it's not so good. We've got a medical system that's made up of specialties. They don't really communicate very well. My father was in the hospital recently, and I was just re-amazed at how much kind of expert coordination that I, just like a regular dude, had to do to bring things together. Oh, the hematology person said this, and for some reason I'm saying this to the renal specialist. Shouldn't that be someone's job here? But that's not the way our system works. Partly because of that, there's been a great deal of difficulty among this population of finding a path to recovery, which is also part of why it's let's just get the hell out of town. Usually it starts, just to give you a little background on how this presents, it's usually either like a long toxic exposure. So there's a woman who worked as a kid in strawberry fields, and so there's like long years of pesticide exposure. There's other people who had their apartment sprayed for bugs or something, so it was one big blast. And so it may begin where you find yourself sensitive to one small thing, but then there's this phenomenon called spreading where you become more and more sensitive until if it keeps going, if you can't find a way to put the brakes on, you just find yourself out where I found some of these characters they're just living out of the edge of the world where there's just nothing.
So many thoughts. One of them is, I think one of the reasons why I find this diagnosis and these people so compelling is that I actually think there's some parallels with addiction in that for a long time, what I have was considered pretty much a mystery and considered, it's just in your head. Like you could stop anytime, like you can control this, right? And also there were lots of different cures attempted. Yes, there's this one big thing, but how do you stop this one big thing was the question, right? What are and there's still actually a lot of controversy about what the best approach is, and one in which science and spirit have some competing ideas, right? Like a big controversy about AA is that it's a so-called spiritual solution, and science doesn't like that. But the other thing I thought of is, and maybe another parallel with addiction here, or interesting comparison point, is one of the researchers you talk about describes environmental sensitivity almost as like the opposite of an addiction.
Claudia Miller,
right?
Yeah.
Could you go through what that means?
This was a ways back, but I think that she was framing it as like an inverse. With addiction, you become more and more desirous of a certain chemical input or substance input. And with environmental sensitivity, it really is the opposite. Like you can tolerate it less and less. So there's details there that I don't totally remember because this was a while ago, but that's the general idea.
I guess I thought of it as more like the way that I thought about was that there was something else. It was about this reaching a tipping point part of it that made it resonate with me.
Yeah.
This idea that at some point everything's fine. And then all of a sudden it seems to, like you said, I guess with some people it builds and some people it's a general exposure. Right. But I guess you can say that for addiction too.
That is, the rain barrel theory was a metaphor that she used. So it's funny, there's all these interesting ways to throw your arms around it somehow and capture this idea. And the urgency of these efforts and the desperation of them reflects the condition of these people who are desperately trying to understand what's going on with them. Even the professional theologians, as it were, of the disease make you feel this way. They're trying so hard to figure out what's going on. And there's so many models that are thrown around, whether they're neurogenic or psychological or Pavlovian, behavioral, whatever it may be. There's so much effort that goes into it. But it's also interesting because, as you say, some of these things were misconstrued relatively recently. And even now I can see changes. COVID changed so many things. Right now, for instance, I'm writing about labor unions and COVID basically scooped me because it just changed the way people think about labor unions so powerfully. But in the same way, you hear people talk about long COVID now. So before COVID, if you'd seen something like long COVID, let's say it'd be like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. And those diseases were met with skepticism and, if not derision. COVID comes along, and now long COVID is regarded as a real thing because enough people have it, and enough people have had short COVID to believe that this is actually a thing. So these things do change and evolve sometimes even without any new scientific breakthroughs happening. The frame can change depending on what's happened.
Will you talk about Kuhn's paradigm shift at one point in the book, and how the scientific thinking behind this is the fact that scientists have not been able to get their arms around it might be a function of just where paradigm we're in, right? That it's not even really the science that needs to progress. It's just literally like the way of thinking about it that needs to progress. Yeah. And I think we might have had that tipping point because I've been fascinated with this illness since Todd Haynes' SAFE came out 30 years ago, right? I found that story incredibly compelling as a young person because it resonates already this idea of being what they used to, this now seems like a little bit condescending, but being allergic to the modern world was a phrase that people used. Already resonated with me, right? Oh, yes. I also understand what that means. I understand what it means to have this physical reaction to the discomforts of the outside world. But it seems like the science of it and the way people think about it had not changed for 30 years. Like reading your book, there still had not been that much progress especially in how doctors talk about it. But relatively recently, I guess it is just the enough people problem, maybe. What do you think? It is that. I think there's a couple things. First of all, Thomas Kuhn, for anyone who isn't familiar with this dude, he wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And basically, it's, as you say, look, things don't happen linearly. We go along for a little while and then boom, there's a big breakthrough and that changes the playing field. And part of what's interesting to me about this is it really goes against our intuitive sense of things and more than maybe at first glance, because you think that it's the job of science and the specialty of science to engage with the unknown, that's its job, but it doesn't really do it very well. Scientists
approach their profession in a linear way when the way it actually progresses is pretty nonlinear. One of the lines out of it, I was just skimming through the book recently to remember what the hell I'd written, but one of the lines was like, only a fool expects new knowledge to be unsurprising. That's Kuhn, and it speaks to how things change and why things change. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was why the fact that you were drawn to this disease or interested in it when you saw a safe. I think that we're all fascinated in stuff that reflects our own fears. I think that there's very few people who don't have a concern about whether we are living in a safe world. There are very few people who don't wonder whether buying organic is really going to be better for them or save them from cancer 40 years down the road. And juggling all of these risks in the modern world we live in and trying to make sense of them is a calculus that's beyond most of us. Whether it's drinking 4 glasses of wine or driving without a seatbelt, we're always constantly in the process of trying to make sense of the field of risks that we face. And those risks have changed. I suppose the other thing that has changed is it's not just that COVID has shifted in shifting our view of this, but I do think that there is a political piece. Certainly, when the other parallel with alcoholism is that there's a profoundly rich support community for people with environmental illness, which makes sense because if you're not getting it from anywhere else, you got to make it up yourself. But of course, this happened in the age of the internet, where this thing, first of all, it's much easier for people to come together. But second of all, it's much easier for them to sit and stew in their own juices, which we see happening in the political field as well. People get caught in their own little echo chamber. It can lead to some very florid and baroque stuff. As far as the political piece, I feel like there's a sense in which with identity politics that people have been encouraged to believe that they are deeply entitled to their own identity. And I suppose they are. The problem comes is when that comes before everything else, but like the continuing existence of democracy, let's say. But there is a way in which environmental illness fed into that. So people were led to believe that they have a right to be sick in every way that they want to, any way that they want to. This is what drives doctors crazy. You actually can't be sick any way you want to. You can only be sick in the way that I want you to be sick. And if you're not, then it doesn't count. But because of this kind of change in the way we are allowed to think about ourselves, I think that at least allowed environmental illness to develop on the patient side, if not on the doctor side.
You write a little bit about this, and it's the sensitivity that we've come to have about people's lived experience, I think might be another way to frame it beyond like just identity, although identity is how we talk about our lived experience sometimes. But even I know a bunch of disability rights activists, and in the spaces where people try to talk right, to try and be respectful from others' pronouns and whatnot, we also talk about people-centered language. Right. There is among some people talking about addiction and recovery, they want to say person with alcohol use disorder and not like alcoholic. Personally, fine with alcoholic. And like the autistic community has decided they're fine with saying they're autistic. But we do have in one part of our world people that are very intentional about allowing people to define the terms and also to base those terms on their lived experience. And so if you believe you are sick, and this is something you circle around to a lot in the book, which is that who am I to say that you aren't sick? If you are telling me you're sick, then you are showing me your symptoms. Even a doctor, where the problem comes in is when a doctor is, no, you're not. And that is when they retreat to these communities, and that can become houses and become places where misinformation grows, even as support grows. Right. And
there's actually a big sort of feminist piece of this too. There's a history of women not being seen and recognized by the medical community. It's a really ugly history of it, and it goes up until relatively recently, and it certainly is the case with environmental illness. Like there's stories of women being told by doctors, well, why don't you just go home and take a hot bath, have a glass of wine, have some chocolate, you'll be fine. And what wouldn't make you want to swing an axe at someone who said that to you? I was actually thinking about this earlier this morning in the context of recovery, and I was thinking like To what extent is all of this, so much of what we're living through now, an effort to recover from patriarchy?
So the first step is admitting you have a problem.
Right. But then what? I don't know.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think another interesting way that intersects with social justice, there's a few, but you were talking about the fact that women are often told, like, it's all in your head, hysteria, whatever, long, terrible history. Obviously, people of color and people from other marginalized communities have gotten that same thing as well. And when we talk about how COVID has expanded the number of people who seem to have parallel illnesses, parallel experiences in the world, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and long COVID, all of these things have some overlapping symptoms, overlapping presentation. Another thing that seems to be happening is when I look at this, I wonder how many poor people might be able to call themselves someone with environmental illness if that's what they had access to, right? If that's what they had to call themselves. Like, there might be millions of people who have this, right? Who just don't have the bandwidth and the luxury and the resources to go to a doctor and talk about it in the way that some other people can.
And even if they did, the doctor would be like, try some chocolate.
You got to lay off the junk food.
Yeah.
Like, live someplace that has less chemicals, and that person can't go to someplace that has less chemicals.
Yeah. Yes. So in terms of the incidence of the disease, just a word or two about that. Definitely, I do think it's more women, but I just had a couple of notes here that I pulled up about some of this stuff. A lot of it has to do with, this is one of the points I always come back to with this book, is an idea of how many bodies there are. I always think of that Da Vinci drawing of the Vitruvian Man, the dude who, I think they stenciled it on the side of some spaceship that they sent out. Check us out, this is what we look like, who's inscribed in the middle of a circle. So there's like an ideal, almost like a Greek ideal. It's got to be a Greek idea. There's one human body. And
Platonic, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes.
So medicine grew up around this idea. I don't know why, because they could, and I guess because you got to simplify something. And because who's going to judge?
Because the people making the rules looked like that.
Yeah, and definitely, right? There's more than one body. This isn't going to be news, but guess what? There's at least two. And once you start thinking about that, there's probably more. Like, I have a male friend who is 6'3", huge guy, and he's incredibly sensitive to antidepressants. Me, I could throw down like a whole jar and there's barely a blip. He can take 30 milligrams of Wellbutrin and he'll feel it in a snap. So, like, bodies are different. Male bodies, female bodies, within a gender, within a race, there really is no way that I am aware of that the medical world tracks them or thinks about bodies in this way. They think about bodies through the optic of what they're used to thinking of as wrong with that body. Anyway, so women and men is the obvious difference, and it's so easy to blame women for being sick. Like, 70% of chronic pain patients are women. But then if you look at the studies, 80% of the pain studies are on male cells. And it wasn't until 2016 that the NIH began requiring their grantees to study both genders. 2016. These biases still exist, and even in terms of where people live, like, poor people are more likely to live in polluted areas. And they're also less likely to have access to healthcare, less likely to be believed by doctors when they go in to complain about something. Yeah. So there's definitely like a social political angle to all of it.
And you mentioned labor unions. And I actually wanted to bring up labor unions because one of the doctors you talked to in the book has a kind of, not really throwaway, but says something about how American medicine is corrupted by pharmaceutical interests, of course. And it's both a conspiracy theory and true. And that in Europe, because labor unions have such strong representation, there's more attention paid to occupational health and more attention paid to, like, what kinds of diseases this might be. So that's just a very simple place in which labor unions pop up in your story. And I'm curious if you've been doing research on them now, and you mentioned how they scooped you on COVID, what intersections there are there.
Oh, totally. I was in your neck of the woods relatively recently, just before COVID. So I guess that isn't recently anymore. It's all blur.
I was going to say.
So I don't know if Local 26 in Minneapolis has crossed your windscreen, but
no. I'm also in Austin, Texas now. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so they're based in Minneapolis, and they represent janitorial workers. So I went out there when I was just starting this research because, oh my God, I've come such a long way. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. But at the very beginning, the reason that I got into this whole thing was because Trump, and I had to do something. And I realized that there was a disconnect between my own stupid liberal worldview and something about labor unions. The idea of a labor union felt vaguely threatening or alien to me. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you're a fucking idiot. There's no way that you can continue to harbor this stupid bias when this moron is driving our country into the ground. That cannot be. We can't afford these biases and these splits and these divisions anymore. It's just got to stop. This is one of the messes, like one of the boomer messes that we need to clean up. And maybe even a little bit of a Gen X mess too, to the sense that in any way that we contributed to this ongoing split between working class and liberal middle class or whatever the hell I am. The beginning, the way I went about this was the typical kind of crash in and do the sort of exotic take on far out, like militant labor union people, which is like the way that I approached the Sensitive thing in the first place. The Sensitive book was originally pitched as a GQ story. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, I just can't throw these people under the bus like that, because that's what would have had to have happened.
I know the framing you're talking about. I've been a magazine writer. Yeah. Look at these nutcases.
That's right. And it's such a lie too, because like I said, a good part of the reason that we're interested in the nutcases is because we secretly fear that we're nutcases too. And so we're going to figure out about ourselves at their expense, which is pretty shitty. So anyway, I was being shitty. And I went out to Minneapolis and I sat in on the militant training school for union members, which was interesting in all kinds of ways. But eventually I have to get to the point, which is that they were in the process of working for a new contract. And there was this new idea bubbling around, relatively newish or reinvented or reintroduced, that you should not limit bargaining to the typical wages and benefits, like the typical deliverables. Whose idea was that, and who does that serve? Who's controlling the conversation, right? So they reframed the question, which is, what is at stake in this conversation, or what could be at stake? What comes into this conversation about, like, where am I working, what the work does, what this work does to me, what it does to the community I live in, and so on. So they opened all of this up and started looking at that. And it was reframed under this idea of bargaining for the common good. So this is a phrase I want to stick in your head because it's super important if it's not already there. And the idea is that basically, so part of the reason, and this idea jumped out at me because I realized that part of the reason that I had this ongoing bias against labor unions was this stereotypical sense that they were just out for their own stuff. And it was a classist bullshit that I somehow was programmed into me, and I let it happen somehow or other. But anyway, the idea of framing it as bargaining for the common good really challenges that and suggests that that labor unions can bargain not just for their people, but for their communities and for everyone who's affected by the employer they're working with and the work that's done in the community. One example is finally getting to my point. The union represented janitors in downtown Minneapolis office buildings. The office buildings kicked out a ton of environmental pollution. They used waste disposal systems, incinerators that were based in poor communities. So there's a connection in all of this. So they added to their list of demands, we don't want you to use that incinerator anymore because it hurts the people in our communities. And we don't want you to use like toxic chemicals as cleaning agents anymore because our people are working with this shit for like decades. And it's not so good in the long run for them. So this doesn't show up on your balance sheet, but it shows up on ours. So it was like redefining what the balance sheet is and saying, this is the one we're going to be going by from here on in, if that's okay with you. And if it isn't, fuck off.
Yeah, you call it the sensitives and there's the canary in the coal mine sort of idea about it. But I think the idea of sensitivity is really broad in the sense that they should remind us of how sensitive we all are to all of these things, all of the changes in our environment, all of the changes in our community. Like these people are on just the downstream they're not even downstream. They are literally just more sensitive. Mm-hmm. Like it's not even that they're further down from all the other bad stuff that's happening. They just happen to feel it more than other people do. Mm-hmm. I really do like this idea of bargaining for the common good. I think it's true. And I think what you referred to before is like COVID made us all more aware of that. Mm-hmm. COVID made us all more aware. I think another reason why probably some people's, feelings about this stuff or the sense of a scientific paradigm shift might be happening is because how threatening the world became for everyone with COVID. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 4 years ago would have been pretty weird to be wiping down all your stuff outside your house when you got home from the grocery store, like these people did. But then almost exactly 4 years ago now, what were we all doing? Like letting that stuff off gas in our garage because we were afraid to bring it in, like wearing fucking masks. So I think we've just become more able to imagine that level of sensitivity in everyone. And I think there's a labor piece to it too, right? We now understand what frontline worker really means. And what I hope is people understand that frontline worker doesn't change just because we're not in a pandemic emergency anymore. Yeah. That's a term that exists outside of a pandemic.
COVID really cranked the contrast. And because I do think a lot of what I end up writing about, it occurs to me, is power. And the powerlessness most people feel, and I mean it, and the powerlessness that you feel in just a daily way. In order to participate in this conversation, I had to update my browser. In order to update my browser, I had to update my operating system. I could go on. All the shit I had to do for you.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And doing all this, like in updating the operating system, I had to change all of this other shit. Like my transcription software doesn't work anymore. Right.
I'm so sorry.
I didn't decide who decided that we need to keep updating shit? Like I'm fine. There is a fundamental sense of powerlessness built into our lives. This gets a little bit back to the risk piece that, oh my God, the theorist that I draw on pretty heavily in the sensitivity book is this guy, Ulrich Beck, who wrote this book in 1992 called Risk Society, because he hated the word postmodern and he wanted another term for it, among other things. But basically his argument is that the risks have changed. The risks and your response to them had some element of proportionality to them. If you invent a bicycle, you invent a bicycle helmet. It makes sense. And we could all manage the risk. They were all under control. And then the industrial age happens, and then the nuclear age happens, and things start getting pretty far out of control until we can't really control anything anymore. And such risks as we can't control it's our job, because certainly the government can't protect us. You just feel your way forward in the dark, and you keep buying our organic lettuce. So the point is that there's this basic powerlessness that we all live with, and we have to figure out what to do about it. And COVID comes along, cranks the contrast on this, and suddenly we are all feeling this powerlessness in a very sharp way. And we start asking ourselves, how has it come to this? And the trick is that it happens like with this magnificent slowness that you can one update at a time. 10.11.2 is the next operating system. Then 0.3, and we accede to it little by little, and it changes little by little. And slowly we give our power away in exchange usually for convenience is how the transaction works. The Sensitives book was largely about trying to, if nothing else, these people stepped so far back from society that it gave them a pretty clear optic for looking back at what they had left. And that's the optic that I went in search of. Like the book ends somewhere like on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, just way out in the boonies. This guy's living out in the woods. It's the only place that he can tolerate. And from there, you look back at the society that you left, and it's a lot easier to see what's going on with that society and what you have acceded to, what bargain, not for the common good, but for something else, for corporations or for your own individual selfish needs, you signed off on. And in the same way, like the Union book is in pursuit of the same thing. Like we gave away this power. That was a mistake. How did that happen? And how can we get it back? And how can we keep from giving away more? And one answer is simply organizing, which is unfortunately such a tiresome word, but also like extreme, possibly like paranoid vigilance.
It's funny I can actually circle this back around to addiction, because as a 12-stepper, of course, the very first step is admitting you're powerless. And so when you were talking about this and going on about the powerlessness we all feel, like one thing that I come to truly believe is that we are powerless. It's just our awareness of it changes. Like we're all genuinely powerless beyond our own skin. In rehab, they used to call it the hula hoop around us. That's the extent of one's power, is just inside that hula hoop. And that what the modern age may have done is allowed us to think that our power was even greater than that. And we are now maybe in the postmodern era having to scale back and scale, like realizing, oh no, like it's that hula hoop, the illusion of greater and greater power is shrinking back again. And I like where you landed with all that, though, because in the construct of the 12 steps, the way we begin to feel spiritually whole, the way we begin to be able to navigate our world, not necessarily have power over it, but to be sane inside of it, is to experience community and to let go of individual tight control. And instead, we talk about turning it over to a higher power, which doesn't need to be God. It can be the higher power of a community, a union, an organization. The power that we have as individuals only extends as far as we can reach. If we want to have power beyond our arm's reach, we have to have more arms. So if we want to change anything, it's going to take more than one person to do it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although I do think it depends whether you're talking about like the world that you're living in or just yourself. I also think that one of the questions that rides behind that is to what extent can we change things in ourselves? How much we can change things in the world is a relatively practical question. To me, I feel both sides of this question. Certainly, I have the desire for more power to make this world less shitty, and to put it more in the hands of human beings as opposed to corporations and bought politicians and so on. But in terms of one's own power, there is a question of like how much you can change and how much you can control. You may be able to, if you're sick, you might be able to change that. But that's because you have this idea, this pre-existing idea of homeostasis to return to. Can I change myself as a person? Can I become less gloomy? My wife asks me all the time. I don't know what the answer to that is. I could take some drugs.
And I think that my 12-steppy answer to that is that you can't change yourself, but you can let go. And in letting go, change happens.
Let go of what?
Let go of a less sort of ho-hum, or a less like Wu Wei put it, is letting go of the outcome and focusing on the action. Like, if you want to change yourself, can you change? I guess the right question is, can someone change? Yes, someone can change. Can someone change into something real specific that they have in mind? Can someone have an ideal that they want to reach and then get to it? Maybe, right? There are some things like a weight that you want to reach, right? But could you change your mindset? Can you become less gloomy?
Could you become a teacher?
You become a teacher. That's a set of professional skills.
No, but it's not.
Right?
It's not that at all. If I said to you,
yes. Actually, that is a very good point. Can you become a teacher? If someone is not a teacher, can you become one?
Could you become one? Could you, Anna? If I said, look, I want you to go get a master's degree and start teaching high school students. That's not like a question of professional skills. The professional skills you got down, like you could learn that in a snap. The hard part is, could you become this different person?
Is it within me, or am I? I actually already teach writing workshops. I think I'm a pretty good teacher. I think I am a teacher. Could I become credentialed as one? Yes, I think I could also become credentialed as one.
To me, it's a question of on what do you draw your identity? Like, where do you get your strength from? Where do you get your affirmation from? What limits do you accept for yourself? Part of the appeal, the dangerous appeal of being a writer, and I know you know this, is that's not very well defined. It's pretty much open-ended. And so it encourages you to believe that you could possibly be the biggest thing the planet has ever known. And when we're young, we're super vulnerable to this. You could be awesome. There's basically no limit. No one says that to a high school teacher. They say, look, you could be a good teacher. You could help some kids. Now, to me, That's a very healthy message to say to someone, because it's relatively modest and it has some sense of proportion to it.
I'm laughing because you could help someone is enormous and also a big ask. If you talk to an actual teacher, an everyday teacher, how often do they feel like they're really reaching somebody? They may have gotten into it thinking that's what they wanted to do. But it's a huge thing to do that.
Yeah, no.
It's a kind of miraculous thing that happens. So I think it's a pretty big, I think I appreciate the cynicism about how being a writer is an enormous ego boost all the time, basically. Or it is, and then you realize like the limits of the profession and the industry that we're in. Actually, like when you were talking about being working class and not being working class before, I was like, writers, actually, I think we are working class. I think that's something that I've had to get my head around, that it is not that I contribute. It's labor. And like, we should probably be doing more collective bargaining as writers.
Yes.
Like our industry, one of the reasons our industry is suffering is because we've been so atomized and so in competition with each other. Do you want to talk about newsletters? Let's start. But like the newsletter economy is everything, is where journalism has been headed, and it's what is wrong. Mm-hmm. But we can talk about it.
I believe you. But I also, it's interesting to think about, why is this? To what extent do we do this to ourselves? Being a writer is based in a very deep way on individualism and having extreme individualism. You have to be individual, almost sometimes fanatically individualistic to do the job. And if you're that way, then there's probably something wrong with you.
I know there's lots of things wrong with me. Like I have diagnoses, but
you have to, prove yourself. So you've got a bunch of like sick people who are trying to resolve some like deep quandary that they came into the world with, or maybe they just invented it in high school or whatever. I lived in New York for many years. I eventually had to flee because it was like, oh my God, it was such a toxic place. I don't even think that word existed at the time when I was there, but it just felt, I used to work at the Paris Review. I was an editor there for a number of years. And at those Paris Review parties, they were fun and they were a thrill, but they were also just like the cagiest phenomenon you'd ever want to be a part of. And I had to get out. I just had to get the hell out of there. I don't know that I do any better today because I work alone in this office, and someone tells me that it's been 4 years since COVID started, and it surprises me, but I don't know what this is to say. What writers are all fucked up.
I know this is fascinating. And I think it does come back to sensitivity in a way, developing sensitivity to the world. I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of a sick society. I left DC. I lived in New York as a writer. I know exactly the kind of stuff you're talking about. We may have crossed paths at one point. DC is a much nerdier version of New York in terms of writing and politics, but the same competitiveness, the same always have to be on the lookout for what else someone else is doing. The same sense, the one thing that really was dangerous for me was that work never stopped, which is still something I have trouble with. Because like when you want to have, you and I probably have a good time talking about how writing off everything in your life is both awesome, but also it makes it impossible to, everything is work. Everything will always be work. There is, in the sense that sometimes I feel guilty about like writing off XYZ, and then I'll get an idea for something like doing some random, like going a random movie, and I'll be like, oh, this is what I do.
Yeah. I don't know if you're still married, but it can be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it can. I was married. My first marriage was to a fellow writer. It didn't work out. And my second marriage was to a non-writer. So I don't know. It's probably me. But what I was going to say about it is that leaving DC and New York did help me, though, because although internally, like I'm probably always going to have a bad brain-blood barrier about my work life, in Austin, even, what do you do is not the first thing someone asks you. Usually it's, when did you move here? That's actually the first thing someone asks you in Austin. But it's not, what do you do? And that wasn't in Minnesota either. And that little thing is incredibly important.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I feel like you're making efforts every now and then to steer things back to recovery and the book and so on. And that's good. My contribution is that I feel that I like the idea of homeostasis. I like the idea of finding your true size and your true proportion, where you belong in the world. It's usually more a matter of not figuring out how big you are or how big you could be, but how small you are. And I think a lot of the AA stuff helps you with that. And that's why the greater power or higher power is a big thing, because the message there is there's a ceiling here. Like there's no way that you're going to be on the top level ever. So shut the fuck up. And there's a story an A friend of mine tells me, super smart guy. This guy is so smart. And he was a serious drunk, falling down drunk. And he goes to his first AA meeting and he's standing in the back and these people are getting up telling these stupid sob stories. And this is, what the hell am I doing here? These people are a mess and that guy can't even make a sentence. And he's just about to walk out the door. This guy walks up to him. He's beat up old clothes, unshaved. He looks like shit. He looks at my friend. He's like, "Is your first meeting?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's the first one." And he says, "So I bet you think it's hard thinking you belong here, right? You probably think you're too smart for this, for all us, don't you?" And my friend said, "To be honest, yeah, I can." And the guy goes, "How's that working out for you?" So that was that point made. All to the question of like, how big are we? Where do we belong in the larger scheme of things? To what extent should we be relying on other people? To what extent does our atomization by our political affiliations, our personal identities help us? To what extent does it set us apart and create barriers between us? How do we not lose sight of that? On what playing field should I aim to be operating? How big, how small, how local? I did one good thing in this little town that I lived in an effort to get at some of this, which was a number of years ago. And I was still had a New York hangover. And I was still very much a magazine writer. I thought there's something super unhealthy about trying to compete on a national level. It's not really human. In the same way that if you look at Olympic athletes or pro tennis players, you marvel at them, but there's something grotesque about them. It's just honestly grotesque because when you have competition at that level, it narrows someone down to such a fine point. And at that fine point, they're an exceptional individual. But so much gets bent out of shape in support of that fine sharpening of this individual. I believe that. I don't really know like how to resolve that with all this other shit, but I know that for a fact. Anyway, so what I decided to do was to start this local magazine because I live in this liberal town that has all these like deeply liberal problems that mostly have to do with communication and people getting their backs up about shit and wanting to talk stuff to death. So it was getting to a point where we couldn't make really basic decisions about whether to fix potholes. So to me, it seemed like a communication problem. I thought, oh, hey, that's me. I do that. So I started this live magazine show and I built it like a magazine. So there's a front of the book where there are 3 short interviews. And then this was back when like Moth and Ted were beginning to become big things. So I thought, well, I'll have 2 like feature slots and I'll put like a Moth story or a Ted story in there. I live in an academic town, so there's plenty of talent around here. And then I'll have a musical act, and I'll have a poetry prize and whatever. And this will be like a utility for my town, like same like electricity. Like every town needs someone to help them with their communication, because why would you think that people know how to talk to each other on this level? They just scream at each other. And there's a super narrow bandwidth of editorial page in our crappy newspaper that's always about to die. But it was an interesting experiment because it was totally not sustainable. But it was like, it was such a nice feeling because I had the sense of proportion. I felt that a high school teacher might have. Here I am. I have my world, my people around me. I'm doing good in this place. I'm not just out for myself. I'm serving a local purpose and I'm making things better in a real way. And it was nice. I had to stop doing it eventually because I couldn't afford to do it anymore. But it was an interesting.
Sorry. That is such a lovely story. And I had to stop doing it because I couldn't afford it. Yeah, capitalism, man, this sucks. Yeah. Like this beautiful thing that you had to stop doing.
I thought that the town should just like create a line item. You don't have to give me a ton of money. I don't make a ton anyway, but I'll do this for you. And I will improve the political, like mental health of this community by 5 or 10% a year for this amount of money.
I wish I could give it to you. I wish, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. What you're making me think about is, I guess this is what happened when 2 journalists get together. Eventually, you start talking about how journalism could save everything. If only we were given the proper tools.
Well, we can. Of course we can.
I firmly believe there's some truth to that. I think my therapist asked me once when things were really bad politically, and he's a great therapist. He did not normally bring up politics in our conversations. He knew what I did for a living, but wasn't what was when I was there for, not really. But one time we got done talking and things were at a particularly high pitch point in the world. And he asked me what I would do. He said, how would you address this? And I was like, universal basic income and nationally funded like journalism outlets. Those are the two things I would do to fix journalism. And then actually that would fix a lot of other stuff too. If we could have reliable, if you could let go of control of the politics of journalism, if you just allowed more people to be able to be journalists, just have that be an open pathway for people who don't have necessarily generational wealth to rely on, who can, so we don't have journalism is still like the starting field is internships, which is just grossly unfair. Someone did a study in the New York Times, masthead or whatever, and it's 70% of the names on there from some top liberal arts school. That's it.
Yeah, 100%.
And if we had more representation in journalism, and I do mean just wide as representation as possible, and if you want to include like conservative viewpoints in that, fine. Yes, as wide a representation as possible, class, ability, race, sexual orientation, religion, all of that, we would have better politics.
Yeah, no, so. I agree. If only because the stuff gets, again, like stuff that is left off the balance sheet, by which most decisions are made, corporate and political, are human stories. The centerpiece of this new union book are these negotiations that are conducted between the union and the company. The companies are, in this case, nursing home companies that work around zero the epidemic. And these are some slimeball people. These are some seriously messed up people. And the union that I'm writing about is unusual in that they have open negotiations. So all of the workers are invited to the negotiations. So this is actually huge because getting back to who is controlling the conversation, who decides what you can say where. So for instance, a company might be fine with you shouting something in downtown Minneapolis at 10 p.m., but they're not going to be so happy if you say the same thing at a corporate negotiating table. They can control where you say things, if not what you're saying. As soon as these workers come into the room, they bring with them stories that aren't supposed to be there. And that's what journalists do at their best, I think, is that they bring the stories and perspectives of other people and make sure that those stories are heard. I also think that politicians do that when they are at their best. I was thinking back about Obama recently and wondering, like, what the hell was it about that guy? What did he bring exactly? He was obviously charismatic, but I think he didn't have too many brilliant ideas. I think that he had one idea. That was an old-fashioned political idea. I think that he went out and he talked to a lot of people, and he had a very simple observation, which is that these are all people, more or less. They all more or less want the same things. And so let's start with that. And there's something hopeful about that. I think that's where that guy was coming from. I think that presidency began with that almost journalistic impulse. So the farther you get away from the human beings and their stories, the shittier your decisions become. And the shitty the environment becomes, right? So
well, I think stories and narratives are incredibly important. And there's a reason why you and I are both attracted to doing this. And you talk about fucked up people being involved in journalism. And I think part of that might be that stories are how we heal. And that is literally true. I did this big story last year about trauma as a national phenomenon. Can you have the national trauma, community trauma, communal trauma? And there's pretty good evidence that you can, that a community suffers a traumatic event in the same way that an individual does. And we are living in a traumatized society right now where lines of communication are bad. Atomization is occurring. Our sensitivity is dulled and hypersensitive at the same time in a way that a traumatized person can be that way. And the way that you heal from trauma, literally the way you heal, the way that all the different trauma modalities that exist out there, from EMDR to ketamine to somatic therapy, even somatic therapy, all of it is designed to help you tell yourself a different story about what happened, so that you can integrate who you are now with who you were then, and you can tell a story to yourself that ends in a whole person, or ends in a person that is continuing on their journey. Because what trauma means is to re-experience the past over and over again, to be stuck in a loop of the same story over and over. And I think maybe one thing that can be right-sized about being a journalist is, while that is our job, and it is really powerful and stories are incredibly important, and yeah, sure, that makes journalism pretty important too, is to remember that actually everyone is telling their story all the time. Like, that is what human life is, to tell your story. And I like to think, I want to believe that I've become a better journalist as I've realized that I just have a specific job that says that. That happens to be in my job title, but that is what everyone is doing.
Yeah, I know. I find like I have almost no response to that, which means that you must be absolutely right. And we're approaching like the 1 hour mark here. So if you want to just like shut things off now and that, like you get the takeaway. Tell me where to sign.
The win?
Yes, that's the win.
I usually do ask people if they have anything they want to mention before we close. So I will do that.
No, I don't know. I think Anna had a really good idea. I encourage everyone to find their own stories, help other people find theirs, and don't let other motherfuckers tell your story for you. Don't do it, because they will do it if you don't tell it yourself.
That's where we're going to end. And that was Oliver Broudy, a freelance journalist living in Massachusetts. He's written for Men's Health, The New York Times, Mother Jones, and many other publications. And he's working on a book about labor unions. If you are interested in using your labor to create something, again, please take a look at my writing workshop. You can find out more about it at anamariecox.com/thirdstory. If you sign up in the next couple weeks, you can get 25% off with the discount code EARLYBIRD. And I will be back next week with another story about getting better.